Hello and welcome to this new podcast episode on Actual Spirit. Today we're talking about Hegel on psychedelics, and here I'm with Cadell Last. So the basic point of this conversation is to explore a territory that, as far as I know, probably has been explored by the most by Cadell Last himself. And we're going to get into the different dimensions of what psychedelics even are, and what Hegel's relationship to psychedelics is, what Hegel's philosophy himself can mean for psychedelics. But the first very concrete question I want to ask you is, what brought you to psychedelics, and in what kind of setting did you do psychedelics?
All right, great to be here, Dimitri, and this is an exciting topic because I've talked a lot about psychedelics and I've talked a lot about Hegel, but very rarely have I had a chance to put these two topics together. So I'm looking forward to what might emerge in this conversation. Um, my context of encounter with psychedelics was I still remember, I think it was around the time I was 27. And I actually came across a TED talk, a banned TED talk on ayahuasca, and I just fell down a rabbit hole being interested in it. I sort of had a bunch of prejudices about psychedelics from probably my high school days, and all of those blew apart when I was, doing research, listening to these TED talks about psychedelics. I know a lot of people fall into psychedelics because they're looking for some sort of relief from trauma, or they're looking for some healing. I always went to psychedelics from the point of view of mysteries of the mind. And to me, psychedelics were such a bomb because they opened up dimensions of the mind and opened up dimensions of what questions about what consciousness was, which I had previously not experienced in sort of like, studies of, say, scientific cognition or psychology. So that was my attraction to them. And my first like deep exploration of psychedelics phenomenologically, experientially, was in the context of the Santo Daime, in fact, which I know you've just had some experience with as well. So for context of the Santo Daime, they are a Christian organization in Europe, and they practice ritual use of ayahuasca, and provide a container for that experience, which is facilitated by music, by dance, by various aesthetics, which really holds a nice space. It holds a safe space, and it holds a divine space. And what emerges in that space is unspeakable. It's ultimately not something that can be, it's impossible to communicate. It's like you're on the other side of the black hole. um and what a trip, what a thing to experience, what a gift to receive. It still blows my mind that I fell down that path. It certainly had a huge impact on the development of my thinking and my life experience. um yeah, I guess only other thing to say is that to have that gift in the context of a container like that is just infinitely richer and more precious or valuable than exploring psychedelics in more of a recreational context, where I feel like it can just be, it's the wrong set and setting, to use jargon that everyone in the psychedelic community knows.
Yeah, I think that's so true, that when we're talking about psychedelics, we're interested in psychedelics for spiritual practice.
Yeah.
So they're a means, they're a tool that one can use for self-insight, self-reflection, encountering themselves, encountering what we could call maybe the borders of language or of consciousness or of spirit. And whereas recreational psychedelics just seem to want to get kind of orgasmic ecstasy from the experience. And then, of course, you got the that famous word called bad trip. I did some psychedelics, but I'm never gonna do it again because I had such a bad trip. But when you go to Santo Daime, to this actual sacred space, which has a whole narrative about it, and the ayahuasca itself is seen as a sacred medicine. If you would puke during the trip, it's not like, oh, you had a bad trip and therefore you had a bad experience. No, this is part of the bad trip actually tells you something very, very truthful about your own experience. So that immediately brings up Hegel for me, because in my paper on Hegelian Tantra, I affirm this in regards to tantric sexuality, and that is that the self-encounter that you, the meeting of yourself, which is possible in the tantric realm in a very singular, unique way, with the use of psychedelics or sexual practices, even though they can be negative, must be taken up by spirit, because spirit's power itself is to, like Hegel says, to stay with and wallow with negativity. So whereas usually we flee from negativity, and in our lives, they're kind of organized around fleeing from negativity, whether it's food, whether it's from sexuality, the entertainment industry, psychedelics and tantric sexuality are both means whereby one can encounter themselves, which, yes, it can be very ecstatic, but also can be deep negative experiences. Now, when I went to the Santo Daime 2 weeks ago, during my trip, which lasted for 12 hours, I had both experiences, right? So I did start vomiting eventually. I also had extremely ecstatic visions. But for me, I really went into it with the idea that I had to be aware of it all, no matter what it was. And this has a beauty in itself, really, when you're in the experience and you can do it, and you can be, even though you're like vomiting, or like you're having many negative things are going through your mind, if you just stay aware with it, that can actually bring you something, which seems quite paradoxical, because usually, to change ourselves, we have to do something, whereas in a psychedelic experience, you just have to have the courage to stay aware of whatever you're experiencing. So something very important as well that you touched upon is that the first thing that you probably say when you've done such an experience is that I will never be able to communicate what I have experienced. No matter what words I use, no matter how long I speak, no matter how poetical I make it, I cannot communicate the truth of that experience. Now, Hegel has a lot to say about this. So where do you begin to connect Hegel and psychedelics in this sense?
Well, it's an underexplored relation. I would even go so far as to, I would maybe pose this more as a question, but I wonder the degree to which continental philosophy in general has explored psychedelics, and if that connection is underexplored, why is it underexplored? My intuition would be that it's worth diving into, and specifically, there are many passages in Hegel's, specifically what comes to mind always are these passages in the chapter on consciousness and the phenomenology of spirit, where he talks about the inverted world and the supersensible. To me, the inverted world and the supersensible, I actually remember when I was teaching the phenomenology of spirit, you were saying it's hard to understand the inverted world ideas in the consciousness chapter, and because I was saying, they remind me of a psychedelic trip, and now maybe, do you have a does it make sense now where I was making this connection when I was teaching? But it's one of the crucial connections, I think, was already made by you, and I just want to sort of emphasize that your project with both tantric sexuality and tantric pharmacology, I think you refer to both, what unifies both of these practices to me is this paradox of the negative, that or like what Hegel calls ordinary consciousness flees from the negative. And both tantric sexuality and tantric pharmacology, they expose you to the negative. And I think that what is so crucial to me in this sort of Hegelian observation of what we could say are mystical practices is that they are totally not within this sort of what I would interpret to be a naive mysticism, which just links the mystical to bliss, or links the mystical to awe, or links the mystical to divine union, or something like this. Like, these forms of interpretation of mysticism certainly would escape Hegel's sort of dialectical sieve, let's say, because it's like you say, when you are going through negative experiences in either a tantric sexuality experience, or whether you're going through negative experiences in a psychedelic context, that these are precisely the moments where there's possibility of learning about the self. It's precisely about letting the self go. This is what self-relating negativity is. And like, for example, I remember one experience I had with 5-MeO DMT, where literally in 5 seconds yourself is going to be blown apart. And when you're experiencing that for the first time, it's absolutely, there's nothing scarier. I mean, you're just going to be blown apart. And if you hold on, meaning if you hold on to your ordinary consciousness, it's going to be a nightmare. And the same thing with ayahuasca. I remember my first experience with ayahuasca was basically like encountering like a black hole, like where I'm like facing this like eternal abyss, and like time was going to fall apart. And you just have to let go. Well, at least I let go. And when you let go, you fall into you can experience ecstasy and love and transcendent visions. But what's interesting, and I think where the crucial logical link with Hegel is, at least to start the conversation, would be in this paradoxical inversion of the negative and the positive, where the negative is positive. And I guess the next connection would be the relationship between ordinary consciousness and perhaps what we could call mystical consciousness, if you want to call it mystical consciousness. And then, how do we approach this dialectically would be an extremely important conversation, especially in the context of widespread or large-scale psychedelic use, if it becomes normalized in our culture, because it's not just going to be about exposing people to psychedelics at the wrong time or in the wrong place, but it's going to be more about how do people sense make or integrate these experiences after the experience itself. Meaning, how do you go back to ordinary consciousness from the state of mystical consciousness? That's really where Hegel's attention would be, I think.
Yeah, I think that's right. And talking about the ordinary consciousness, words that are being circulated by people who do psychedelics is that you have an ego death. Now, if we relate ego to what is being said in neurology, which is the default mode network, sure, you could perhaps have an ego death, but I'm actually not so sure that the ego disappears. And I'm quite skeptical of this idea that the supposed oneness that is experienced is really a oneness, because then I don't think you would be able to experience it if there is only a one. Or in other words, there has to be a minimal split between perceiver and what is perceived. Now, for sure, I do believe that the ordinary consciousness has a certain faculty of the mind, which it uses to make distinctions in the world and basically to build its own life world and have a worldview. This is called the faculty of the understanding, right? The world, like through the senses, the world is organically one. And like if I am looking somewhere with my eyes, there's an apple and it's red, but when I talk about it, I'm making a distinction between redness and the apple, whereas when I'm perceiving it, it's immediately a red apple. You see what I'm saying? So language makes a distinction between the very redness of the apple and the very appleness of the red. If you can, if you grant me this. So this is a basic mode of thinking, right? To make distinctions and to deem things self-identical. The apple is the apple, otherwise nothing would make sense. So I do think that when you go into the psychedelic experience, the apple can perhaps not be the apple anymore. And like you already alluded to the inverted world, things start happening which don't make any sense to your ordinary consciousness, or to what Hegel would call the faculty of the understanding. So I'm quite sure that this explodes when you go into a psychedelic experience, but I'm skeptical of this idea of the ego death if we understand the ego to be what is being said by neurology. And I'm also not sure if this ego death, if we can understand it to be the death of the Freudian ego. So I'm curious to your thoughts about this, also in relation to the supposed oneness experienced in the psychedelic trip.
Right. So the concept, yeah, I mean, I remember actually on the way to both on the way to explore 5-MeO-DMT and on the way back after sort of my trip to explore 5-MeO-DMT, sort of having this conversation about a basic skepticism of the absoluteness of the one that is purported to be experienced precisely because of this sort of minimal separation. Now, if there was a substance that could get you closest to a sort of one without any separation, where you sort of have no more experience anymore, it's kind of like the Fichtean absolute self. I guess 5-MeO-DMT would be the experience that for me comes closest. There might have been actually a moment in the 5-MeO-DMT trip where I'm basically not in experience anymore, but by definition, I wouldn't remember that, or I didn't experience that, so that was the closest I ever got in terms of any substance. Like when I think about exploring psilocybin mushrooms or peyote or DMT even, and ayahuasca. The concept that I like, which does appear in Hegel and I think is developed certainly by Zizek, is the idea that the one is a self-repelling one, meaning the one never completely coincides with itself. It constantly creates it creates a self-repelling gap with itself. And this is where you get sort of A-B. It's not just A, it's A-B. So you have it's a split one. And I think that the idea of a split one is not only an interesting way to think about our ordinary consciousness, but I think it's still kind of what you're experiencing in the psychedelic space. It's probably just a closer proximity to the self-repelling one, perhaps. In regards to like sort of the Freudian model and like the distinctions between id, ego, and superego, I think that the interesting thing here to explore is the history of psychoanalysis with hypnosis, because psychoanalysis starts with hypnotic experiments at first, and the idea is that hypnosis dissolves the ego and takes you to your sort of more primary psyche or primordial psyche, dissolving some of those egoic barriers. And I think psychedelics does the same thing. Now, is the ego death total? Is the default, and linking here in neurological terms, the ego to the default mode network, is that total? And I think it probably depends on a mixture of what substance you're using and the quantities you're using, and perhaps also your experience with those quantities. But I mean, these are definitely open questions.
Yeah.
But but in the Freudian model, it does take you to the id. I would say. But I mean, all of these registers are constantly interacting. I don't think any of them completely dissolve.
Right.
Hmm.
Yeah, I think perhaps we can link it to Freud's the oceanic feeling that he talked about, that he said he never experienced himself, and was actually proposed by a mystic. So for Freud,
Yeah.
this experience entailed a regression to the womb, basically.
Yeah,
Basically,
what we're dealing with here is that there's a complex web of signifiers which are the result of your immersion in language from birth. And there are various means by which those can be dissolved. Hypnosis is one, psychedelics is another. There are probably many others. Probably sexuality is one where that dissolution can happen as well. And Freud's problem with these mechanisms is basically that they don't get at the contradictions of the egoic signifying chain itself, meaning that once you dissolve that chain, it's just once you're out of that state, meaning once you're out of the hypnotic state or once you're out of the psychedelic state, that chain just reemerges. So you don't deal with the problems of the ego, you bypass them.
right. Right, and I think that really connects well with both Hegel and Lacan, because for Hegel, the concept is central, of course. The notional, Hegel's all about the explication of the notion or the concept. And for Lacan, the signifier is central in psychoanalysis, or like the truth in speech, or perhaps the truth that terrorizes speech from within or without. But anyhow, speech is central indeed. And this also brings up the question of integration, because for like the way I understand tantric sexology and pharmacology is that actually what's the most crucial is not the experience itself, but how do you bring that experience back to your daily life, right? So to ask a very simple question, do you think the psychedelic state escapes Hegel's philosophy? Do you think that the tools that Hegel gave us with dialectical thought and speculative thinking, do you think that cannot apply to speculative to psychedelic experience, or do you think, on the other hand, that it happens within the notion, within the concept? So how do you think that relates?
No, I think for me, how best to approach this? Um, many people would think, many people do think, rather, that, for example, psychedelics are introducing you to something more real than you can encounter with philosophical logic. Or psychedelics are introducing you to something more real than you could possibly encounter with a psychoanalytic therapy. And I think that is misguided. And not only misguided, but potentially dangerous. I think that both, and so both, for example, your emphasis on the tantric sexuality and the tantric pharmacology, to me, in order to be interesting in a Hegelian sense, they would have to be worked out conceptually, and integrated conceptually. Like in other words, they would have to become sort of meaningful parts of the social order, and that we would have to have sort of whether institutional's the right word, whether network's the right word, whether religion's the right word, whether culture's the right word, we would have to have some sort of normative order that had sort of embodied the concrete wisdom of moving people through these experiences and demonstrating how the results of these experiences have a necessary determination for the becoming of world spirit. Does that make sense? Like for Hegel, it's all about the results. So you have the immediate experience, but it's all about the mediation and the result of that immediacy.
Right.
So when you get lost in the immediacy of like a psychedelic trip or a tantric sexual experience, and you cling in your identity to those experiences, that is obfuscating the actual difficult work of bringing that state into day-to-day life. And that's always what I stress with psychedelic people, is that what would impress me about the psychedelic community is if the result of their immersion in these experiences led to an objectively better social world. But I haven't seen that yet. And there's a lot of enthusiasm and there's a lot of optimism about that. You know, I think there's a study at Johns Hopkins University on psychedelics where they talk about the dangers of spiritual accelerationism, where basically you have no connection to the transcendental, or you have no connection with altered states of mind, and then you investigate psychedelics and you explore psychedelics, and you have the equivalent of like you think you've experienced God, or you think you've experienced Jesus, or you think you've experienced the Buddha, and then you go back to your normal life and you're the same consciousness that you were on the other side. And there's such a gap between your transcendental experience and your actual self that actually can create a huge psychological problem in people. And I actually experienced that to some degree, which I'm open to talking about, by the way, about the problems of what I think is correct to call spiritual accelerationism, because you can have contact with states of mind which, without that substance, might take you decades of spiritual practice to cultivate in oneself naturally. And I think that what all yogis would emphasize is the natural cultivation of these states of mind within oneself. And that's not to say that you shouldn't use psychedelics or you shouldn't use any mind altering substance, but just to say that I think a lot of yogis would emphasize the long and arduous labor which really builds this into you as a sort of natural chemical process.
Yeah.
But just to summarize, perhaps, I don't think that this escapes Hegelian dialectics or psychoanalysis for that matter. I think rather we need actually more people who have a dialectical training and who have a psychoanalytic experience, who can potentially be the types of cognition, the type and be aware of the forms of logic which would be necessary to integrate these things into our society in a meaningful way. Because if you don't have that training, these are just going to be ecstatic immediacies which have no meaningful result in a large scale. And like, before I stop talking, I'll just give one example, concrete example of the history of the psychedelic research, which I think goes in the wrong direction. Now, this is in the example of Stan Grof. Now, I'm a fan of Stan Grof. I recommend Stan Grof's work. He's a pioneer in psychedelics. He is a pioneer in applying psychedelics to psychotherapy. However, in the history of Stan Grof's mind, he started out in psychoanalysis and Freud and Jung, and then he reached or came into contact with psychedelics and thought that the knowledge of psychedelics eradicated the need for traditional psychoanalysis. And I think it's the reverse situation. I think it's that once you've experienced something in the psychedelic realm, in fact, psychoanalysis becomes potentially even more important. So it's just, I think we need to invert.
Yeah,
the opposite is true.
Yeah, for sure. And like there's an element to the kick seeking that's, you should embrace enjoying that whole experience. It's not that we're against that, or that you're against it, but it shouldn't be the ultimate aim or goal. And also I think it would be important to emphasize that it's like, what would you think about the idea that this state itself is an enlightened state, or some kind of state of absolute knowing? Would you reject that, or would you say it's more like, because the way I see it is that it's not directly the enlightened state, but it is a means on the way to what we can understand to what we can call enlightenment, or what we can call absolute knowing.
Yeah, it's certainly an intimation of enlightenment. It's the experience of the immediate. It's the immediate experience of that. But again, it's an acceleration to that standpoint, which is not something which you have. It's almost like a cheat code. It's like, I remember when I was a kid playing video games, we had a game genie. And if you had a game genie, what it meant was you put this game genie in your system, and you basically have access to like do whatever you want in the world, meaning you can do things that you ordinarily wouldn't do, and you could beat the game very quickly. And psychedelics are kind of like the game genie of enlightenment. It's it's like, oh, you put this game genie in, and all of a sudden I'm there. And that's what Terence McKenna liked about it so much. He was like, you don't need to just sit under a tree for 20 years. All you need to do is pop these mushrooms, and boom, works like a charm every time. But the problem with that, again, is that it doesn't build that sort of into your system, and you're sort of left with, especially in a very individualistic society in which there's no meaningful institutions which hold you in this experience, like, the Santo Daime does their best, but it's still, just like a place you can go now and then and stuff like that. That we definitely need to think about we definitely need more. We need to think more about, and we need more studies about the after effects of these experiences for people's spiritual development. Like, so for example, if I was to communicate my experience, was that because when you're in the psychedelic trip, everything seems to be so naturally meaningful and overflowing. I had the experience, going back to the quote unquote normal world, that it made the idea of work, it made the idea of, following certain rules, searching for certain forms of recognition, even that much more difficult. Because it was like, I was so aware of the heights of the meaning and the heights of the wonder, that I was like, well, actually day-to-day life is really difficult. Like, it made me realize how difficult day-to-day life was. And I think I remember actually, like, the difference between my consciousness before and after psychedelics, and I don't regret doing it, but the difference between my consciousness before and after psychedelics was, it basically blew apart all of my identification with the big other, to the point where it made operating within the big other extremely difficult. Because the big other is still there. I still have to go through the hoops of like finishing my doctorate and applying for jobs and paying my bills and all this stuff.
Yeah.
So, and it's not like there's many people you can talk to about this process either, or like anywhere you can really go, like, it's not like, I mean, this is a pretty, it's still a pretty, let's say a esoteric or marginal, activity and a hobby or path of exploration.
Yeah, I really like the point that you made, and I really feel the same way after my experience with Santo Daime, that you become way more, you really get opened up, and then you become way more vulnerable to
Yes.
to whatever happens. Like, you see
this word. Let's hold on
Yeah.
to this word, because it opens up your vulnerability. Same with the tantric sexuality and the
Yeah.
tantric pharmacology. It opens your vulnerability.
Yeah. I actually do think it's a very similar kind of opening up. You feel it in your chest. You're more sensitive to negativity. You take notice of anxiety and stress quicker, not only in yourself but also in others. And it would be also so interesting to connect this to microdosing, by the way. But so basically, you're telling that you did the psychedelic experiences, and you experienced the transcendent highs, and then you go back into real life, and then there's a huge gap between them. Now there's the people who affirm the oneness of the experience, which is perhaps one way one disavows the very bifurcation or the very division between the daily life and, you know, the experience in the during the use of ayahuasca. What you did is you went to Hegel instead to deal with the gap.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. So yes.
yeah,
Yeah.
what's so special about Hegel that he seems to be in touch with both realities at once? At least that's I assume that has to be the case, right? Because otherwise you
Well,
wouldn't
yeah.
have found that connection.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, like the form of Hegel's logic is always as this sort of self-repelling one. It's always like a two, which you think is separate, but is actually in a dialectical logic is interrelating and has a higher order relation that you just ordinary consciousness can't perceive. That's the dialectical logic. So yeah, I think that what's so special about Hegel is that it's not okay. So let me even say, like, it's not even like what's so special about Hegel. I think it's the nature of dialectical logic. Now I think like because I think like my hypothesis would be, and I don't think I'm alone here, is that I think Plato and the Plato's Academy was messing around with psychedelics as
Mm.
well. I don't, and Plato like Plato was an ancient master of the dialectic. So I think what it does is that playing around with altered states of consciousness, it makes you realize that the way in which you are structuring your knowledge and the way in which you're identifying with things is on the register of the understanding, and psychedelics blow your understanding apart, so you become aware of this sort of higher order oscillation of knowledge. And I think that in Plato's case, he's putting the idea, like the absolute idea, in some external realm. And you could imagine, like, especially in the ancient world and having those experiences, you could say, well, that must be an other realm. And that's
Mm.
actually the spontaneous intuition of many people. Actually, I read a
Yeah.
book about I read a book about the Santo Daime, and many of the people in the Santo Daime identify with a Platonic conception of the suprasensible, and they actually think they're entering an actual other realm. So like if you actually do I had an interview on my channel with someone who did their doctorate on the Santo Daime as an anthropologist, and he was studying sort of their metaphysical beliefs,
Yeah.
and like they're basically Platonic. So you can see how this form of knowledge emerges. It's interesting to study the history of that, and you have a concrete example of a modern community which derives the same conclusion. Now, Hegel's not positing that the one is some other realm. He's even putting that realm into a dialectical analysis with a historical process. And so that's where I think we get a more modern understanding of the dialectic. And it's also not just a negative dialectic in the Kantian sense, but it also has through the negation of the negation, it has a positive dimension to the dialectic. So that's where we have to think the results of these processes. And so like it's, for me, my focus as a philosopher is not so much on people's intuitive identifications with the experience, but more on the results for their life and the way in which they sense make these experiences in conceptual determinations.
Yeah. Yeah, that's those are very interesting ideas. I think in regards to Platonism, Zizek rehabilitates Plato. For Zizek, Plato is not someone we should just reject, or because he's ancient, or because he had the idea about the philosopher kings, which is a lot of people say it's totalitarian. So do you see in the Slovenian school, and especially in with Hegel and Lacan, something that could like have a conceptual understanding of psychedelics that perhaps can motivate like the building of new institutions which um can hold like this the experiences, and also the speech of the subjects after the experience, the reality after it, um like in a more mature sense, in a more mature philosophical sense. Like what is the place of philosophy for this? Or another way to ask this in a more concrete way is that should philosophy prescribe what we prescribe what we can do with psychedelics. You know, should philosophy is it the place of philosophy to say we should have containers for this? This is a good thing, and we should do something with it.
Okay, so there's a lot of threads there. So I'll try and do my best picking up these threads. I think part of the Slovenian school's rehabilitation of Plato is basically it's a negativist interpretation of Plato, in my view, which basically means Plato's super sensitive. This is how I think about it, actually, and this is alive in my work as well, is that the super sensible realm of ideas in Plato becomes like a negative black hole. So it's like you replace, and like think about how like interesting that is to think about modern cosmology, because like black holes as like they are kind of like Platonic objects in a sense, because they're where our normal sensual reality breaks down, like everything we can observe empirically and so forth. And literally the space-time coordinates become inverted, where space-time becomes time-space. And this is there are models here that you can study that are developed by Roger Penrose, where he does a very interesting job of inverting space-time to time-space. And I actually think that time-space is actually an interesting way to think the psychedelic experience. So all of this becomes really interesting for thought. I could go a little bit deeper into sort of how I think this rehabilitation is really important for today. But the overall thing as it relates to a conceptual understanding of psychedelics that motivates building of new institutions is that in order to build new it's a feedback process between the understanding of subjects and the understanding of the institution as such, or something like that, which is not embodied in any one subject, but is kind of like the collection of subjects. And so what psychedelics do is blow apart your understanding. So like I just recalled in my personal experience while I was at school, while I was doing my doctorate, was that psychedelics blew apart any of my identifications with the big other. So it blew apart my identifications with the institution, and it made my life at the institution a lot more difficult. You know, as a consequence of that, I would have been a much better subject, a much more well-behaved subject, much more within the lines and so forth, if I hadn't done that, right? In that sense, it was actually quite dangerous, you know. But in terms of building new institutions, the way I think about it is that it's been described that people who are experimenting with psychedelics are at the moment kind of Deleuzian, and myself included, whether I identify with Deleuze or not. We're kind of like a rhizomatic network of like fungi, you know, like we like, oh, like you connect with other people who have also done it. Like the new tantra is probably similar. It's like some underground rhizome, you know, where you form these little assemblages and stuff like this. You know what I'm talking about. You've got some experience here, you know. But the question is, do these rhizomes and do these assemblages mature into a new, different form of society with different networks and different institutions with different logics? That's the question. That's the conceptual question of the maturation of these networks. And when they mature, do they take the same form in the end as the current institutions? Do they just become reified in the same way that we're just stuck in this ridiculous circle? You know, that's a horrifying but potentially real possibility. In terms of should philosophy prescribe what to do, I mean, I think that philosophy, at least the philosophy that I follow, places a priority or a primacy on conceptualization, on logic, on thinking, you know. So I think that philosophy should, and but philosophy after Hegel has always required sort of like its own exterior to reinvent itself. So like when I think about like people like George Bataille, for example, where he's exploring limit experiences and liminal spaces, you know, I think that the question for philosophy is, how do we recuperate, or how do we sublate or even sublimate all of these limit experiences and you know, and pushing the limits of our consciousness. So like I even consider my own philosophical gesture in the world as a kind of sublimation of the mystical. I explored the mystical. It opened me up. It blew my whole conception of scientific materialism out of the water. And then I've got to I've got to reconstitute, the way I think, the way I relate to knowledge, the way I speak, the way I relate to the other, all these things, right? And that to me is where philosophy is important.
Right. Yeah. So that means that in the end the it's the it's that's very interesting what you said about the exteriority of philosophy. And I wonder if that's perhaps maybe always been the case, that philosophy has had to maybe parasitize on something else. Actually, Hegel does talk about this in the Encyclopedic Logic, that for philosophy, like the magical, esoteric, mystical, alchemical traditions have been very important to it. But still, even though that's true, for Hegel, there's too much of these like mythological configurations which kind of muddy the waters, and there's an enjoyment of like the cloudiness of like losing oneself in the mythos of those traditions. And
I think he calls one particular mystic turbid, meaning unclear.
Yeah. He talks about that more often now. There's like the clouds of like the hazy clouds, and then you take away the clouds, and then there's the sky of clarity and conceptual clarity and this kind of thing. So I think if you relate this to Lacan, this like the question of jouissance becomes very important here, because it's not simply that those people are stupid. Well, I never think the answer is probably never that people are just stupid. The questions are more for me like in regards to jouissance and psychological resistance. So it seems to me that whether it's tantric sexology or tantric pharmacology, that people are quite psychologically resistant to those modes of jouissance and really being open about it. Now, also, the same is the case for philosophy and as such, and also Hegel, the Slovenian school, and Nietzsche, right? Like the subtitle of Also sprach Zarathustra is a book for everyone and no one. So it's for who it really is psychedelics and philosophy both, because for me, like I have recently written an article called "The Mystical is the Rational," and there I say that actually reading Hegel and really working through it seriously already is a kind of spiritual practice. It's a very high level form of spiritual practice, and with that I mean that it's like conceptual, right? It's
Absolutely.
not the raw immediacy of spiritual practice, but there is the decision of like there's a sense of Hegel being very slippery, but he's also very sharp and poignant, that you're like, oh damn, I would have never thought this. And I remember the first time when I read the Phenomenology of Spirit, you continuously think that, okay, finally I got to the sentence where I get it. Then you read the next sentence and you're like, oh no, shit, I didn't understand it at all. You retroactively understand that you didn't understand anything at all. And that's just what's happening all the time,
Yeah.
And that's kind of what the book is for, even.
Yeah, it's a training. It's training your mind, because he's demonstrated in this logic, and he's catching you every time you want to close.
Yeah, exactly.
I like this. I like also your emphasis that Hegel is slippery and sharp. I think this is very nice. Because usually mystics are very slippery and very hazy, and analytic philosophers are usually very sharp and very precise, but Hegel is both.
That's why in my article I talk about how according to Badiou's descriptions, he cannot be reduced to either philosophy or mysticism in Badiou's conceptualization. In this sense, he's a scientific mystic, which is super paradoxical. Now there is this there's these popular memes going around, right? About, oh yeah, if you take psychedelics, this is how your brain will look, and you see everything light up and it looks so nice, and you're totally fascinated by it. But actually, I mean, I would like to make a public announcement and ask scientists to make a brain scan of someone who's reading Hegel. Like,
Well, there are funny memes about that as well, where they show you your brain on LSD, and it has the brain all lit up, and then it shows your brain on Hegel, and it's like even more lit up.
yeah,
Like, but it's just a joke on this.
yeah. But I think it really has a truth to it, in that, like, the phenomenology of spirit is such a psychedelic drug. It's really, like, if you really take it seriously, and like submit to it, then it will
Yeah,
really change you.
and in philosophy in general, if you submit to philosophy, it is like a psychedelic drug. It's just that it's a psychedelic drug that requires your work, and what you're submitting to is logic and logos and the symbolic order, in some sense, the highest expression of the symbolic order that humans have ever, produced, or that concretely exists.
Yeah.
I can respond a little bit here to this line of thinking. Yeah, I like that there's this combination of sort of the hazy and the sharp, the slippery and the sharp, and like it's kind of like Hegel is like he has the sort of distributed cognition of the psychonaut and the default network at the same time. Like, so it's like it's distributed cognition completely, and the default mode network's operating really well, and so they're both like that's his oscillation, like, and he like keeps you there, and like he is training you, and that's the whole point of reading Hegel, is not for you to identify with his words in the book, but for you to submit to him training you on how to assert a conceptual determination and then dissolve a conceptual determination, and see how going through that process of determining and dissolving actually led to a higher state of reason, or speculative capacity.
Yeah.
Is perhaps the best way to think about it. In terms of the question, I think this is like the mega question for someone like you, and even like I would say it's a mega question for me as well, is this question of jouissance and the sort of spiritual practices that you're involved in. Because certainly these spiritual practices are manipulating one's experience of jouissance, and why one has a sort of resistance to these practices is because if it's kind of like you have a rational totality, which is a circle which can't close in on itself, and there's a little gap where jouissance appears, and if you explore that gap, it will blow apart your rational totality. So what people are resistant to, and we should be very sympathetic to this, and it's not like, oh, exploring the jouissance is good and the rational totality is bad.
Yeah.
We should not have this model at all. It's that we have to be like, we have to relate to both ourselves and to the others with an extraordinarily high sensitivity to their dignity and the risk involved in, just blowing your entire conceptual scaffolding apart, right? Like, but in any case, like when you go into these practices, you're exploring this little gap where jouissance is, and you're like kind of in the inverted realm, where it's like, oh, like you're in the tantric space, or you're in the, and it's totally the obverse or the inverse of the ordinary consciousness. And the thing is that your identity, the identity you build, is always going to have to deal with this little gap where closure is impossible and jouissance seems to be like a immovable object or an impossible object or something like that. And so the question is, how do we relate to these feelings inside of ourselves of impossibility, of the obstacle, like the perspective shift on the obstacle becoming a liberating sort of condition for our consciousness, or something like this. And it's like, when we come to, like, for example, Lacan's ideas specifically of the feminine jouissance, it's like you could conceive of the rational totality as the masculine and the little gap of the jouissance as feminine. And like when we think about this in the context of relationships, it's like, it's not that men or women just want to be freed from all of these totalities and just have the direct expression of the unbounded jouissance. It's that we want to rethink the containers within which we explore the mystery of jouissance. I think that's the question. I think that's the imminent conceptual focus for doing, like, again, the tantric pharmacology or the tantric sexuality, is because it loosens up your rational totality. It allows you to operate from a space where you can derive new conceptual boundaries for these experiences and possible expressions of jouissance. And there, like, I think, to me, that's like pioneering work. It's like you're on a frontier.
Yeah.
It's risky.
Yeah, totally. It's super risky, and it's definitely not for everyone.
It's not.
Yeah.
And people should not feel like this is the worst, when people like when like I actually don't like this about like like, don't want to stereotype, but certain types of mystical consciousness, like viewing themselves as somehow higher or better or something like that because they've explored this more or something like that. It doesn't necessarily make you inherently, I don't see why it inherently makes you wiser or more intelligent or something like that. Not necessarily. It can, but not necessarily. I'd
Yeah, I think there's truth to that, and this is also why one has to be humble when going into these kinds of spaces and experiences. I do actually think that, for me, the way I've explored tantric sexology and pharmacology this year has always been connected to my philosophical projects. So it's never that I just have done it for the sake of it, and it was always a kind of an open-ended journey, and I have no idea where it's gonna go next, but it's probably gonna be pretty intense. Like it always is. So I really like what you said about the mystery of jouissance, because when Hegel talks about the mystical, he says that the mystical is fundamentally mysterious for the understanding, but for a reason it's there's more to it than that. So if we return to this distinction between the apophatic nature of the psychedelic experience, but also the fact that the notion is going to return, and we're stuck with the notion, and that's not even an unfortunate thing. It's just something else that we have to work with. How do you I mean, this is kind of the thing, right? Because once you go to philosophy in the Slovenian school especially, there seems to be this incompleteness to reality. So that means that every way that we're going to conceptualize this is going to be transitory and provisional, because these distinctions, again, they will dissolve in some kind of reason. So there, you've already pointed to the similarity between reading Hegel and the psychedelic experience, which is the fact that your understanding is going to dissolve. Now, you've also pointed to that there is a distributed consciousness and the default mode network, which Hegel both makes use of. And it would be hard to talk about what the future is of something like this. But do you have any thoughts in this regard?
Yeah. So I remember one of my first emotional reactions to encountering psychedelics and experiencing psychedelics was saying something like, and maybe I'm wrong, by the way, also, but my first reaction was saying something like, this is the baby in the bathwater of religion. By the baby in the bathwater, it's like a metaphor. The bathwater is dirty and the baby is worth saving. So you clean out the bathwater and you save the baby. So what I'm pointing towards with that idea, or what I was pointing towards with that idea when I was first sort of reflecting on it, was that you want to have this direct experience to the divine, and you want to hold this direct experience to the divine, and then you want to build sort of your religious institutions or your places of worship around this baby in a way that preserves and allows this baby to be matured. And so it could be that, like, when religions initially arose, because I think religions have an important evolutionary function and religions have a historical logic to them, which is self-justifying and necessary. It could be that religions used to fulfill this function a lot better than they do today, but in the North American context, and I think in the Western context in which I grew up, religions were often seen as preventing one from exploring these experiences. Like they would prevent one from exploring, like, you know, a type of tantric sexuality, or they would prevent one from exploring. I actually remember there were fundamentalist Christians that I was debating with around this time I was exploring psychedelics, and they were actually trying, like actively trying to stop me from experimenting with psychedelics.
Okay.
Right. So what I'm trying to say is that in a Hegelian way, we need to think both. Meaning, you know, you might want to say, on the one hand, it's the direct experience, and on the other hand, it's the institutional normativity. And we need to think both somehow. And I think that's where dialectical logic becomes important. And so it becomes very easy for ordinary consciousness, and it becomes very easy for, let's say, traditional logic to collapse on one or the other. Either I'm going to do the direct experiences and I'm going to negate religion, or I'm going to identify with religion and I'm going to negate these direct experiences. And I think we need to think both.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's true, and I definitely think that the religions are first cults. Like this is, you know, religion is not doesn't become a religion if it hasn't been a cult before. And
actually, in Hegel's chapter on religion, that's stated explicitly as part of the dialectics of the coming to be of the nation.
Yeah, and if you, I was recently reading about this mystic. I forgot her name. She's from like she lived in medieval Italy, and she when she was 18, she would try to fast herself to death. She shaved her head because she didn't want to comply with the neurotic normativity of society. Eventually, she had an experience which we would call a psychotic experience right now, that she became the bride of Christ, and that he actually gave her a ring. But it wasn't simply a ring, it was actually his foreskin itself. So like we would totally call it crazy and psychotic. But
romantic.
Huh?
Romantic.
Yeah, romantic. But she actually got very quickly, she got very close to the Vatican, and she got in positions of power where she would actually advise bishops and stuff like this because she had those experiences. So this is something that probably doesn't happen anymore in the West with our scientific universe, right? Like we would just put her on pills, put her in the clinic, and get her some cognitive behavioral therapy or whatever we give these days. Probably only pills. That's usually enough to sedate them. But yeah, like when you think about something like this, and that these probably these kinds of people have always been super important to religion. You know, if you read the Old Testament, there's very similar stories of people basically going crazy and then getting closer to power. So now we live in this scientific universe. Psychotics are put in the clinic, and I guess this is in regards to my own projects. This is why I say that the pursuit that I'm doing, whether it's with Hegelian Tantra or my recent article, I call it science. You know, and it is like the Hegelian philosophical science, or the science of spirit, the science of logic, whatever have you. It's the most totalizing science ever, in the sense that you include its opposite, right, which is the subject. So in your recent talk with Daniel Garner, you talk about the objectivity of the notion, which is the fact that actually when you have thoughts, they're not merely subjective, because if you take thought as an object of thought, it's objective. Like that's the dialectics of thinking. That's a part of it, at least. So do you think there is any chance of a rehabilitation and revitalization of philosophical science, or science as a discipline inclusive of the subject, in the radical sense that it can take up tantric pharmacology and tantric sexology?
The thing is that I think, like, in terms of this question, I mean, I think that's what we're doing. I think that the networks that we're loosely associated with, and you know, obviously are much more diverse and wider than just our little corner of whatever our corner of the web is. I think that is emerging. And I think that it's an emerging phenomenon which is happening in the gaps and the cracks of a materialistic science, specifically a materialistic psychology, which is the result of which is the mental health crisis and the widespread numbing of affect and the reduction of thought to ego, that this can no longer hold. That it's just like we are emerging in the breakdown, like our very, like, at least for, I'll speak for me, like my interest in many of the things I'm interested in, dialectics, psychoanalysis, psychedelics, all of these things appear in the gaps of the breakdown of a type of institutional psychology, which is reifying external cognition, to put it, you know, as succinctly as I could put it, where extreme affect is again numbed through medications. We have opioid epidemics. You know, people are put on Xanax and you know, whatever sort of numbing substances they're put on, when really we need to better understand the intense affects of subjectivity, and we need to understand the development of the psyche in a whole new way. You know, when it comes to things like CBT, it's basically disavowing symbolic castration, you know, and thinking that you can think your way into a better state of, think your way into positive moods.
Yeah.
You know, like, so
Yeah.
so all of this is breaking down, and it can no longer hold as a meaningful edifice, and even the appearance of it is no longer sort of has any substantial depth. So I just think so I'll speak for me, like what I'm trying, like my small part that I'm playing in this emergence of a rehabilitation and a revitalization of philosophical science, is that I want to know myself, and I want to teach to others the foundational philosophical texts from which a new culture of mind and society could be built. And I think that that's necessary because if you don't go to the foundational texts and you just go to the mystical experiences, you're not going to be able to think the new society, you know, and I think that's really important. So, you know, I play my part, but I think it's a big thing happening, and, you know, we are a part of it. And the thing, what I'm trying to emphasize here is that there is no big other here who's going to come along and say, you know, like the way that yeah, we're going to include the subject now. Like there's no big other that's going to come along and do that. We're just doing it.
Yeah,
you know? It's very abyssal, you know, the whole, and there's no one to come along and say like, you're right, and, you know, oh, you were right all along, and you know, and there's a way in which like that you want there to be a big other, right? Like you want there to be this imaginary agent that like says, oh, I see you, and good work, and oh, aren't you clever, you spotted that, and let's do that, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, it would be interesting to think, and this is something for the coming next like 20 years at least, of what happens, how society is gonna develop and how culture is gonna develop that do not include the subject, compared to cultures, the emerging subcultures and things like that who do include the subject. And especially in this internet age, right? Since we're so not only influenced but determined by the algorithm. We're like notionally determined by the algorithm. So yeah, that's it's gonna be a wild ride, for sure. To see how this all of this is going to.
I just want to say that actually is our that is, to me, the contemporary emerging big other is the algorithm. I mean, it's the internet has eroded the institutions, and the emergence of the algorithm is basically the new quad. It's not an institution, but it's like, I mean, that's what's regulating our mechanisms of recognition.
Yeah, and Zizek in Sex and the Field Absolute talks about it. He says that actually the algorithm and the digital spaces are where are perhaps the first place that we can say that there is actually a big other, since there is a definite mechanism to it and it works according to certain rules. Of course, like we latch a kind of virtual big other onto that, our own imaginary big other. But when we go to the internet, like in talking about our free time, right, or like our free will, when we go to the internet, we try to escape symbolic anxiety, because that's the first thing we try to do as subjects. We as subjects are anxious. That's our primary affect. That's our primary driver. So we latch on to symbolic, to imaginary similarity or identifications, images, or identifications with other groups of people who are very similar. Now, of course, then that's even better, because then we can also rival with them, which reifies this community even more. And it gives also a sense of self-importance, right? When we're in the same subculture and we're rivaling over the same imaginary images, the very fight itself gives the sense of importance. For example, take Christianity and the minute differences between theological differences between very small groups, or take communists, or whatever have you. Like, to us it looks ridiculous, because like, what are you guys talking about? It doesn't, you're all the same anyway. But for these people, that's like, it gives them so much importance, because it's either it's a similarity or it's a difference that makes all the difference in how they comport themselves socially in that community. So given that we go to the digital space because there's a symbolic lack, because that gives us anxiety, we go for the image here. There's also a sense in which like alien like, yeah, we flee alien otherness, but there's also kind of people, and I think this is what philosophy is about, is like encountering themselves with alien otherness. And like that's the question of like how um can you actually bear the other? Can you bear how alien the other is to you? And if you cannot do this in the internet age, you're going to be in a very repetitive, boring bubble that says the same thing over and over again. Uh, but I think for me, psychedelic experiences, going to intentional community-centric sexology, are means whereby I try to open myself up about, not only my own experience, but also see how do these people themselves experience it. And yeah, I think honestly in this day and age, like to get a sense of self, since it's so defined by the internet, it's there's something to being a creator that's different, you know what I mean? Not only like to be a creator and have all these subscribers or whatever, but I mean like, collaborating with others, and
Yeah, I
for
mean,
your
yeah,
own self-creation going forth and like exploring and meeting new people and things like this. So philosophy is basically where this happens, right? Where we can meet people from all over the world and talk with each other. Of course, it's not simple as that, and uh, but philosophy is a very weird pursuit in the sense that this envy that emerges when you go to small others where you have similarity and difference.
mhm.
Philosophy is actually a place where you can talk about this, or like I've already said quite a few times in Alenka Supanchi's book Ethics of the Real. Zizek has a foreword, and then he says that it would be arrogant of him to say that it's a nice book. And he says, I'm going to give her the greatest compliment that there is, which is that I have huge envy for her writing this book since it's so damn good. And how could I not have thought of this before her? And this
Yeah,
is, yeah,
he said something similar about what is sex as well. I think he has a certain respect for Alenka, which is yeah, well deserved. Well deserved. Alenka's a fantastic writer. I mean, a fantastic thinker, a fantastic theorist. Yeah, and I
yeah.
think she is getting more recognition now. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot there. Is there a specific question you want to have, or I could just respond to what you said in general?
Yeah, you can respond to what to what I said.
Yeah.
Also, in
Okay.
particular, I think my question would be in like this the place of the encountering of alien otherness and how you think about this, whether it's on the internet or in tantric spaces.
Right. I mean, there's a case to be made that this new big other as the algorithmic digital space, and who knows what it's going to develop into with widespread incorporation of artificial intelligence and virtual reality and all of these other things, which is just coming online so fast
Yeah.
now and transforming things so fast now. It's like this is only going to accelerate and get stranger and stranger and stranger. So like the paradox is like where we get an actual big other, and actually in Surplus Enjoyment, Zizek calls it like the actual Platonic idea emerging in digital space. And that's a fun way to think about it as well, and
Yeah.
it's also a scary way to think about it. Um, is that you get the constant transgression of your current boundary or constant transgression of your current self-identity. And that's why tribalism is so endemic on the internet, is because people form these tribes and people form these little cloistered groups because, well, there's so much otherness.
Yeah.
It's like, well, it's overwhelming. So I've got to have a group. I've got to have some sort of sense of identity. I've got to have some set of knowledge, and and we got to be aware of this, and doing the type of thing that you've done, and for me in my own way, is, I suppose, a way in which you can expose yourself to otherness, and otherness to the point where otherness becomes a part of your identity. And I think that's this I equals an other, or this this viewing the alien as a positive instead of a negative, is a crucial dimension of absolute knowing. And at the same time, we shouldn't idealize this either, because there's certainly alien, for me as a particular historical being and so forth, there is certainly an otherness which I cannot bear, or there's an otherness which I cannot see as myself, or I have limits, I have practice, and so there are limits. I think when we think about absolute knowing very practically, it's kind of like a useful, or hopefully even a spontaneous cognitive disposition, which where you catch yourself making these simplistic distinctions between self and other. And so when you're capable of doing that, and you're capable of seeing the other as yourself, you can train yourself to get better and better at being able to do that, and broaden your self-conception in the process, I suppose. I think what it means ultimately is the nature of future adults is going to be so alien to what we traditionally have conceived of as adults. And Alenka, actually, I'll bring up Alenka Zupancic here, because she has a nice line in one of her more obscure papers where she says, where do adults come from? Not where do babies come from? Where do adults come from? And flipping the traditional question. And when we think about adults, like, let me just give the example of my grandfather for a second. My grandfather grew up in the big other, and it was a real big other, for people back in the day, the nation state.
Yeah.
He grew up in the big other of the nation state, and for him, Ireland was his entire identity. And literally outside of Ireland was the devil. Like, he was told that if he goes to England, they'll have horns on their head. And he grew up thinking this. Right? But I'm just using that as an example to communicate how many people within the old world thought, which was that my nation is my identity, and outside of that is the alien other. And it's just that now the boundary has become the entire planet. There is no more I identify strongly with Ireland. It's because your real environment is this digital screen. And that digital screen gives you access to all the other humans. And all the other humans, and you have the capacity to interpret their difference, make sense of their difference, how you relate to it from your point of view. And so the result, and this is just a turbulent process that we're all going through. And we don't know where it's going to end in 2050, or if it's going to end at the end of the century or whatever, when whoever knows what the internet at full maturation will be. That's the reason I wrote the Global Brain Singularity book. We don't know what our identities are going to look like, but it's certainly going to be a lot different than the identities of the 20th century, and certainly going to be a lot different than the identities of the further back you go, because those identities were so local, so provincial, and ours have totally open boundary conditions. And if you think about all of the conservative reactionary movements in contemporary politics, they are symptoms of this, where it's a symptom of there's too much difference and people don't know how to react to it. So you have Brexit, you have Trump. I'm not saying those are bad. I'm not saying they're bad. I'm not saying right and wrong. I'm just saying that we have symptoms of, we don't know how to cognitively deal with this much difference.
Yeah.
And there are, like, this is where philosophy should be, is that we shouldn't just moralize about it. It's like, oh, Trump is stupid. No, that's stupid. Like, that's stupid. Oh, Brexit is stupid. No, that's stupid. We have to think about what are the underlying symptoms of the contemporary globalization, because the truth is speaking in symptoms.
Yeah. Yeah, but Badiou is the philosopher Alain Badiou is a very old man, and he
Yes, he
talks
is.
about living in the 50s of the 20th century and 60s, and going to South America, and how alien it was for him to visit there. And he talks about when he's traveling right now, it's so homogenized, you know, like everyone has smartphones, whether you're in Kazakhstan or South America or Africa. You know, everything there's and this kind of homogenization is, yeah, it's very, the digital has this homogenizing effect. You know, if you look at Facebook, for example, they're massively expanding in Africa and Southeast Asia. And if you will buy a smartphone in Africa or Southeast Asia, the owner of the shop will install Facebook immediately for you. So where it doesn't really matter whether you are, you we all have Facebook, and there's a similarity to that. But there's also the other side of it, which is all this tribalism and difference.
Well, what's homogenous is that it's one big other. Like it's one digital network.
Yeah.
That's homogenized, and like there are many consequences, especially and the political system is homogenized in the sense that it's neoliberal capital. So like, for example, you go anywhere in the world and you go to the main center of any city, and it's like H&M and like McDonald's,
yeah.
and like a sushi place, or it's the same everywhere.
Yeah.
So there's that dimension to it, but it's one big other that includes all human differences. And so we have to, like in a Hegelian way, and also this appears in also complexity science, you have to think integration and diversification at the same time. Like it's one and it's many. It's, and in old philosophical terms, it's the one and the many.
Yeah. Yeah, and also in regards to the political, right? Like I remember talking to a friend who went to Indonesia, and there they have like an Adolf Hitler cafe, because it's just Adolf Hitler is just a meme there, you know. It's nothing. It's you can have an Adolf Hitler cafe. Also, right now in the war with Ukraine, like there is, you know, if you look at President Lula of Brazil, he's not really so critical of Russia, because there's this anti-American imperialism sentiment that's very popular in South America. There's still, so there's like the old world of the 20th century coming into this new world also, but everything is like memeified almost. But to bring it back to the conversation and to the conceptuality of psychedelic experiences, in the first chapter of the Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel talks about the consciousness with its particular meaning. And the question in regards to sense certainty is basically, is whatever I sense true because I have sensed it? Eventually, Hegel comes out of that chapter saying, basically saying that there's a necessity to the universal. So what do you think of this distinction between the particular meaning of one's psychedelic experience and the other side of its the universality of its conceptuality, and the relation between those two in regards to truth?
So I can give a very, so we both know, right? Like just to sort of recenter us, like one of the central Hegelian axioms is the absolute is substance, but also subject. So let me interpret what you're saying here in under that model. Let's take, for example, one of the most well-known, probably one of the most well-explored psychonauts of the 20th century, Terence McKenna. On the one hand, you have Terence McKenna's actual psychedelic experiences. That would be the particular meaning of his experiences and so forth. The universe, the other side, the conceptuality, is Terence McKenna as a universal historical figure. his theories, his books, his technologies, the communities. So it's the actual result of his subjectivity. That's the universality. So Terence McKenna became a universal figure. So the same thing, you can do the same thing with Stan Grof, or you could do that now. In each of those situations, you have a universal, which is the psychedelic experience, or a particular universal, which is the psychedelic experience, and then the concrete universal, which is their singularity as a result. And so that to me is, again, just bring it back to what I've already said before. When it comes to, for example, myself, I'm someone whose mind has also been influenced and in touch with psychedelic experiences. And I'm not just going to be the exact same as Terence McKenna or Stan Grof. My result is going to be different, and so your result is going to be different too. And so it's including that, it's including the conceptual differentiation where we get the level of the Hegelian idea. That would be my understanding.
Okay. Yeah. Do you think that this, on the one hand, we already talked about the apophatic nature of these psychedelic substances, and you also talked about the limits of recognizing yourself in absolute otherness. Yet the paradox is here that this also includes language, in the sense that the very standard to which you measure the apophatic nature of those phenomena are logically implied in the language that you use. So when that language changes, that the noumenon changes also, if you know what I'm getting at.
Could you try to unpack that idea a bit?
So,
like apophatic meaning like an experience of God where you negate the concept you attach to God.
Right, and apophatic in the sense that you can only describe it with negation, or like you only describe it through being unable to describe it. So okay. What is God? God is not this finite determination. It's not this finite determination. It's not this finite determination.
Right. This is not that.
The thing, though, that is that there's a truth to this, of course.
Mm-hmm.
Yet also there's a truth to the fact that this changes. So, for example, take skepticism and Kantianism. Kant was very vehement about himself not being a skeptic, and also not being an idealist who says the phenomenon are illusory, whereas the categories are truth. So for Kant, the thing he was interested in is like, how must our mind be so that the phenomenon appear like they do? And he says they have to be mediated through the categories, or the pure concepts of the understanding.
Mm-hmm.
He also posited the noumenon as the exception to the universality of those categories, which is like their negative reference point, the point of the unknown. And there's on the one hand, there seems to be a certain kind of subjective disposition that you need to have to go into this. On the other hand, Kant, you cannot reduce Kant to the skepticism that came before him, because he's not saying, this is just illusory and everything is illusory and everything will just contradict itself. He's making a very subtle point that gave rise to like Hegelian philosophy, which has never emerged before in history. So that means that the apophatic, the conception of the apophatic changes, in the sense that Kant is apophatic about the thing in itself. We cannot say anything about it. And just like other skeptics or other apophatic theologians would be apophatic about whatever their thing, but it's not it's an apophatic philosophy that changes all the time. It's not the same thing.
There's a historicity.
Yeah, there's a historicity.
Mm-hmm.
There's
So there's a historicity to the noumenon.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of what I'm saying. So what are your thoughts on this, and specifically tied to psychedelic experiences, which on the one hand are apathetic, but on the other hand will, since people think about it differently, be deemed to be apathetic in a different sense?
Sure. Okay. So I think I can say something about this. Um, so there is this idea which Terence McKenna liked, which is called universal shamanism. This idea, what was the book that he wrote about? Like he thought, I guess he one of his prophecies was like a return to universal shamanism, where like the idea here is that most hunter gatherers, in McKenna's view, had some relationship to mind altering substances, and that even he has a hypothesis about it being connected to the origin of language and stuff like that. I'm not sure how far I get on board with that, but it's an interesting idea. We do know that there are many ancient cultures in Africa, South America, and Asia, and Europe as well, where ancient cultures were experimenting with mind altering substances. And each of those cultures, under a type of idea of universal shamanism, developed their own relationship to practices and societies and rituals which would be enacted around these substances. Now, the question about the historicity of the noumenon is precisely, how does a modern, global, digital, neoliberal, capitalist society relate to these substances? Where this is a totally different question than, we can't just identify with, like, a lot of Westerners, especially postmodern relativist Westerners, would just be like kind of deifying and idolizing the ancient South American shamans. Like, let's just try to do it on their terms and in their way, like back 2,000 years ago, like reifying them as like a peoples without history.
Yeah.
I think the question is precisely, yes, we should not exploit people who are, in underdeveloped countries or who lack resources, or we shouldn't just, reenact certain colonial forms or something like that. But we have to think about modern global culture today and the way in which we're going to relate to these substances as 21st century peoples. All of us, not excluding any peoples here, just 21st century global peoples. And so, like, that to me would be the historicity of the noumenon, which would be, building the containers around this experience, which is kind of like going into a black hole. And so, like, in terms of like the black hole itself, it's kind of like always been there.
Yeah.
In some sense, it's ahistorical. It's some ahistorical thing which emerges in history, and we have different historical interpretations and relations and practices and rituals and beliefs about it.
Yeah.
And I think that if you don't acknowledge that there's a black hole there, then you run into spurious infinity, and you run into a multiplicity and a plurality which doesn't have a relation to the all or the one. And this is where I would again bring up the idea that it's interesting, at least, I'm not saying it's right, but it's at least interesting to think of a negativist Plato, where we're not thinking about an actual other super sensible world, but that there's some black hole there.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
What's that about?
Yeah, the way I've been thinking about this is that the subject and trauma are ahistorical, or like the subject directly is trauma. The subject is trauma, and like Alenka Zupančič says in What is Sex, trauma is not something you experience, it's the very point at which experience breaks down, or again, where the understanding dissolves.
She has a section called Trauma Without Experience.
Yeah.
and that's an interesting thing to think. It's you pick up on it, of course, but it's a very subtle, nice point she's making there, and it's a good for anyone who's interested. Check out that section of what is sex. It's just a short section.
Yeah, yeah, and in this sense, if trauma is ahistorical and the subject is ahistorical, since like to be to be born is traumatic in a mythical sense, that means that everything that we're doing against it is kind of a reaction formation that is that's a historical emergence, but not like an there's this something interesting happening that through history and the process of all these people with their communities and practices and religions and art, responding to the trauma of their subjectivity and to anxiety and stuff like this, is that there will come up notions that seems to stick around, like God, the soul, perhaps heaven and hell, but maybe to a lesser extent, but definitely God and gods seem to come up. And what do you have you thought about this? What is, because Santo Daime is all about God, you know, it's about the Holy Spirit, it's about Jesus.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
So what's your personal relationship to Santo Daime as a tantric Christianity and your experience of ayahuasca?
Okay, so for me, Santo Daime, again, I would want to like first express an extreme gratitude that container exists and that container facilitated my first encounter with altered states of consciousness, because I think that a lot of people experience that in an unstructured, unritualistic way, in a party experience way, or even in like a, I don't know, a burner community way, where there's really not that holding space and concentrated focus, which allows a richer encounter with, you know, something like the Holy Spirit. I think that how I relate to the triad, it's like a triad between God the Father, Jesus Christ, and the Holy Spirit. And how I relate to this triad is God is like the one all, Jesus Christ is like that point of self-relating negativity, and the Holy Spirit is the result of the community, or something like that. Like, and that's what I experienced in terms of like that was an accurate description of like my phenomenological process through my experiences with Santo Daime. Now I want to emphasize that like that structure, that triad, God, Jesus, Holy Spirit, I mean, those are concepts that we're putting on a certain phenomenological process, and they, you know, they map. Now, I mean, what they're ultimately pointing towards is something of a self-sacrifice towards a distributed, ecstatic collective of some kind.
All right.
Now, how do you, now the thing is that how do you like my first visions in those states were like, I sent you like my trip reports, right? Like my first visions in those states were like of the ecstatic community. And like I even had visions of the whole planet and like an ecstasy and like all the, you know, the how Santo Daime holds that space like every 2 weeks or something like that. They have their own ritual where they manifest that every 2 weeks. Is it possible that in the full historicity of the concept that's where everything's going? Is everything moving in some weird process of idealization, sublation, or whatever you want to think about it as, towards, I don't know, some actual manifestation of the Holy Spirit or something like that. Who knows? Who knows? I mean, this is where this is where, for me personally, I go back to speculative cognition, and I stay in sort of like I stay with the historicity of the concept.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that if there's any telos, it's imminent to the process. And like that's it's not simply an external telos that we're all heading towards, but there's an imminent functioning of that telos already being instantiated. Or in other words, I would say that the actuality of potentiality itself is the virtuality of that telos.
Yeah. And I will say, for me, like one of my strongest reactions to that experience is that that's home. Like I remember like many times in that experience where I'm just like, this is home. This is, everything's in some sense reconciled.
Mm-hmm.
This is joy. This is a becoming which never stops, which and at the same time, I don't want it to stop. It's, I guess I would put it as the immortal drive. Like that's how I understand the immortal drive. Is like it's just this keeps going.
Yeah.
Eper si muove, and yet it moves. You know, and that's I mean, that's how I've made sense of this. And at the same time, you know, like I would say that I've distanced myself from psychedelics, not because I don't appreciate them or gain insights from them, but I think it's a lot of the times out of pragmatic necessity, that in order to function in and build a life as an adult within a capitalist society, I have to be careful with how I blow myself apart, because if I just blow myself apart completely, I'm not going to be able to function in this world, you know, in some sense. And you know, so in that sense, I do think that what you're doing is you're rolling the dice with your symbolic order. And so like I think myself, and I think a lot of famous psychonauts do something similar, where they expose themselves to the psychedelics, they go through a phase of experimenting with it deeply, and then they might return to it sporadically or periodically, you know, when they feel they need to. And that's how I've done it, is that I go back to it where I feel I need to go back to it, and sort of maybe get a reboot or a refresh or a new perspective on where I am, you know. But it's kind of like in Hegelian dialectics, like you enter a discourse, and no matter what discourse you enter, it will exhaust itself. So like, for example, I've set up Philosophy Portal, which is basically setting up the conditions of possibility of a certain discourse, right? It's, what I say is it's about exploring modernist philosophical discourse. So I'm exploring that. I'm in this discourse. It's unfolding. I'm trying to learn how to build it, how to teach it, how to run a business and stuff like that. And at some point, this discourse will exhaust itself. You know, I don't know when or how. I don't know if Philosophy Portal will last for 30 years or 3 years. Right? You know, so, but my reasoning is, when this discourse breaks down, going into something like a psychedelic ritual is a nice place to get a new perspective on where you are, where you've been, and what discourse you might want to enter in the future. But when you're in a discourse and you're exploring the imminent notion of the discourse, going into the psychedelic trip might just blow you apart and destroy your whole, you know, mission. It could. I'm not saying it will, but it could.
Yeah.
It would, but I mean, it might disorient you to a very high level.
Yeah. This is, up to now we've talked about taking a high dose of psychedelics, but there's also microdosing.
There is microdose.
And And have you read Hegel and Psychedelics? Have you read him while microdosing and how, or have you read philosophy at all while
Yeah,
microdosing?
yeah,
What's
yeah,
that
yeah, yeah.
experience?
No, I have, because I was microdosing for a while. I actually microdosed for a while as well, and yeah, I was doing, I was, continuing to do my philosophy work at the same time. Microdosing is, yeah, it's that in between space. So it's certainly not an ego death, or anything that brings you close to that dissolution of the default mode network, but it definitely loosens up your perception. Going for a walk, you want to be in a nice environment. In my experience, yeah, it's like nature's a little more sharp, a little brighter. Your senses are a little more heightened. Interacting with other people is a little funner, I think. These types of things, So it's yeah, it's a major. It's like, I think in a representation I made, it's like if going to the Santo Daime is like going to the top of Mount Everest metaphorically. It's like microdosing is like being at the foothills of the Himalaya, like the you're at the base.
Mm. So do you think it apart from like that the fact that it increases the intensity of certain senses, uh, do you think also it does something to your understanding, to the
Yeah,
faculty of the
it,
understanding,
it,
or to
it
ordinary consciousness?
I think it de-rigidifies your default mode network. So like if you're anything like me, you might fall into some repetitive loops. And so microdosing might, you know, it might give you a nice space from which to reflect on your repetitive loops and
Mm.
introduce some novelty into your day-to-day life.
Okay, so it's in this sense it can also, in my experience, it can stimulate creativity.
Absolutely. Well, that's what it is. Yeah,
Yeah,
that's what it might stimulate a little bit of creativity. It's
but it's
like
very subtle.
it's subtle. It's very subtle. So obviously it depends on your dose and what you're doing and stuff like that, and different effects from doing, say, for example, psilocybin versus LSD, for example. Um, it's on the one end of the dialectical spectrum, there's like creativity as such. And then on the other end of the dialectical spectrum, there's the repetition and structure which is needed to carry out a process. So, like, for example, the creative act for me when it comes to Philosophy Portal is, how do I approach philosophy? How do I teach? What am I teaching? Why? All of these deep questions about like the impulse of the creative act itself, where I decide to teach a certain course or I decide to teach a certain book, and then I try to figure out how to do it. And then there's the repetition of the structure which is needed to actually carry out that process, which is day to day.
Yeah.
Like every day to day, you've got to read the science of logic and build out all the PowerPoints and do all the marketing and do all the pre-course stuff, and all of that takes a lot of practical intelligence and a lot of day-to-day repetitive structure. Like it's not like it's not like I'm saying, oh, I need to do the exact same thing every day, but it's like, if I want to build Philosophy Portal, I have to do certain things every day or it's not going to be actual. But this is the same for any job. Like
Yeah.
if you're an engineer, if you're a pilot, if you're an athlete, if you're a musician, you have to practice every day and build up your skills.
Do you think psychedelics diminishes that the ability to repeat?
I think if you're doing it a lot at a high dose, it's going to be hard to maintain anything with a stability. Or I mean, at least for me, like that's what I was always playing with in terms of playing with fire. So like when I was first exposing myself to psychedelics, I was at the beginning of my doctorate. which meaning I had 4 years, 4.5 years, let's say, to finish a doctoral thesis. I was experimenting with it at the beginning of the process. And then after a year of experimenting with it like 12 times, it's like, you know, like going back every month. After that year, I was like, okay, maybe I should get some distance from it so that I could actually write this goddamn thesis. You know, because it was like, it's not like it wasn't like creatively stimulating. I had a lot of ideas. Like, oh, what, you know, like, and I was getting lots of ideas like about politics and global, you know, I was like, oh, I went into a communist phase, like, well, we all got to have a, you know, communist global politics and stuff like that, you know, and I was, but then I had to write it out. Like I had to figure out the notion. Like I had to write a paper that a scientific journal would accept. Right? They won't accept just a mad ramblings from a psychonaut.
No.
Hey, I had this crazy experience.
Okay, we're coming up to the end here. Do you have any final thoughts about Hegel and psychedelics?
Sure. Like, part of Hegelian logic is understanding that two things that seem really different are actually part of the same unity. So, like, for example, with science of logic, which I'll be teaching through Philosophy Portal starting January 16th, 2023, basically operates on a logic of the unity of being and nothing, which is a strange unity, which traditionally and in pre-modern times, these notions were pulled apart. So you had the pure being and the pure nothing, and you know, even the ground of origin of philosophy was Parmenides and being, and he said nothing was absolutely not. So Hegel has a really remarkable skill in seeing the unity between radical opposites and radical differences, and then deriving new conceptual understandings from this interaction. And if you think about the psychedelic experience, what I'm saying is that we kind of have to make that sort of move with our own consciousness, which is a science of consciousness or a science of subjectivity, where we combine our ordinary consciousness and our mystical consciousness and derive a new form of consciousness from that interaction. Because usually people will think it's separate, like either I'm a psychonaut or I'm an ordinary normie. But what if we think of them together? And what do we derive from that as a process of becoming, to put it in the terms of the science of logic? This is the way I would start thinking about these things, especially after having some distance from psychedelics. These are the way I would think about things, like after having sort of, you know, gone through my own spiritual practice, which is going on still, which includes deep meditation on foundational philosophical texts. So as maybe a closing thought, I would say to invite people who are in the mystical state of consciousness and explored the mystical state of consciousness to entertain the idea that disciplining oneself with forms of dialectical logic can be a nice way to bring yourself into a new type of becoming, which is not just in the mystical world, not just in the ordinary world, but a mediation of the two.
Yeah, well put.
Hegel on psychedelics. There, that was a pretty good synthesis there, or
yeah.
sublation.
Yeah, that's also the finishing thoughts on my recent paper, that Hegel is a scientific mystic, which is the ultimate contradiction in terms.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you for coming, and check out Philosophy Portal. I'll put a link in the description.
Science of Logic starts January 16th.
I'm gonna be joining the course as well, so that's gonna be exciting. And yeah, thank you for coming to this talk.
Actual spirit. There are very few actual spirits, so I'm happy to know one.